Welcome everybody. I hope you had a good lunch and I will make sure I don't bore you to sleep. That's nice. I actually expected 5 people and there's more than 5. So again, thank you for breaking my expectations as well. Let's go. So what am I here to talk about today? Fast and Fracturous, which is basically what my 8-month internship at SideFX was about. So quick thing about me, I'm Viswesh and I'm a marketing FX intern at SideFX. I am originally from India, but I came to Canada to pursue my education in VFX and then landed an internship at SideFX. I used to be a tracking artist and now I'm an effects artist. So what's under the hood today? Literally, like pun intended. So we're going to talk about the 20.5 updates that came about in the RBD section. We're going to talk about how that has been improved with the workflow has been improved with like a couple of new nodes this time in 21. And we're also going to talk about how we can push the limits with that specific workflow. It's all going to be vehicle destruction, so I think it's going to be a feast to your eyes. Moving on. So the Houdini 20.5 destruction workflow. In 20.5, we had like 3 major nodes, which was the RBD car rig, the RBD car deform, and the RBD car follow path. So as the name literally suggests, you could rig a car, you can deform your tires and suspensions using the car deform, and you can basically animate a car. If you don't want to simulate it, you can animate a car along a path, which is also going to look physically real. And then with all these driving setups that we have, the question is, how can we crash it, right? So then my idea was that, okay, out of a drive simulation, we get a geometry, some like cone-twist constraints and suspension constraints, and also like a proxy geometry. That's what the car rig gives us. And maybe using all these, we can maybe fracture the geometry, set up some proxy geometry as well, add more constraints that connect sections of the car together, and then plug that into a crash simulation, and it works. My IQ was peaking, to be honest. But then I saw this demo by Gurmukh Sandhu, who was a previous intern at SideFX, and he did this amazing shot, and I was like, maybe I should take a look at his file to see what he did. He probably did the same thing. Well, yes, he did, but except it looked like this, which was crazy for me to decode. Even though he had everything labeled and named and stuff, but it was crazy, yeah, at least for me. And so let's hold on to this thought and let's jump into what's new in Houdini 21, which is the topic of the year, to be honest. So in Houdini 21, we got a couple of new nodes, starting with the RBD car fracture sub. But before that, I'm going to use this term called CarBD often. I don't know if SideFX intended for this name to be used, but there was this guy called Jason Iverson in the quest that was put out. He kind of coined this name, and it has been stuck to my mind ever since. So I'm not sure if he's in the crowd. I don't think he is, but thank you anyways. Moving on, the RBD car fracture sub. That's the new addition to Houdini 21 this time in the RBD section. So as the name suggests, again, literally, it gets you to fracture your car. But it's not, even though I make it sound simple and even though the tool is simple, let's get into the specifics now, okay? So right when you open this node, you're going to see, again, you're going to see some parameters. So what are these parameters going to do? First up, you have the chassis group, which is basically where you would assign the chassis group of your car, which would include your rear suspensions, maybe the exhaust pipes under the car, maybe even the front suspensions in some cases. And that is basically the group that holds on all the fractured parts of your car together and also keeps the wheels intact. Like whatever suspension constraints you get out of the car rig, out of the drive simulation, this chassis group kind of keeps everything intact. So it's important to have a chassis group when you're trying to fracture the car. And then there's an ignore group, which would include some of the parts of the car which you don't want to be fractured. So you can maybe leave that out by adding them to this group. And then you have a rest frame attribute, which is essential. So you can either set that to frame 1 or frame 115, like I've said it here. This helps all the time-consuming and expensive, time-dependent, expensive calculations to be not time-dependent anymore. And then you have a realign wheels toggle as well, which when you enable kind of resets the wheel right before it enters the simulation. That way you don't get any funny rotations on your wheel. Because if you don't do this, your car doesn't have a rest position that the wheels can use to kind of calculate the goal twist and the goal up axes, which would make it difficult because it's going to try to calculate every frame, which wouldn't make sense for the wheels. It'll spin in weird directions. So enabling the realign wheels is like a sort of a way of setting a sort of rest frames, like it kind of resets on the start frame of the simulation, and then you get like proper wheel rotations. And then the first fracturing section, which is the tire fracture section. So you would select the rubber part of your tires, only the rubber part, because the rims, like the metal rims, still need to be attached based on your cone twist, the car rig suspensions that you get. So you select only the tire parts and you're able to fracture them. You're able to set like a fracture density, which tells you how many pieces you want to fracture it into. You can even add some edge detail, which basically breaks the Voronoi pattern, the uniform Voronoi pattern that you get right off the bat. And this also gives you constraints and proxies, right? Like just by setting this group, you get geometry fractured, you get constraints and proxies. And these constraints don't just come as plain primitives, but it has some attributes. And in this case, because it's rubber, it comes with a soft constraints. And then moving on, you have the sections tab, which is where you would actually start fracturing your car in like different sections. So you assign like parts of the car into one section, you give it a particular name, and every single piece of that section will have a unique name with this name as its prefix, right? And you can also fracture them based on material. So you have different materials like metal, glass, wood, rubber. All these you would commonly find in a vehicle. And so even for the metal, you have like different types of fracturing, which is basically if it's a planar geometry, you could get a sheet fracture. If it's a solid geometry, you can go for a solid type fracturing. For glass, again, you have a safety, which is kind of similar, and to the sheet fracture, it's like a Voronoi fracture. And you also have an impact fracture, which gives you something that you would see out of the material fracture shop. You also have wood and rubber, which is again similar to the rubber is the same as what you got in the tires, and the wood is again the same thing that you would get out of a material fracture shop. Moving on, you have the enable connection to neighbors. So what this does is you're going to separate your car into different sections when you fracture them, and you want each section to be constrained to the other section. This way, your car doesn't like fall apart instantly. By enabling this is enabled by default, but by disabling this, you can also set specific constraints to doors which need to act on hinges as well. So this is again not restricting you to whatever it's giving, but also allowing you to break aside and develop further. And you have some similar parameters such as the fracture density, which again lets you set the number of pieces you want. And also you have a thickness parameter. For example, you saw the metal planar fracture, like the sheet model, which is, again, you have a planar geometry, and the RBD bullet solver is not good with like just planar geometry. It needs some like convex hull shapes, which is what this thickness does. So the RBD car fracture shop extrudes the geometry and creates a convex hull underneath. So by adjusting this thickness, you can have your proxy geometry to be as thick as you want. And then you have the edge detail parameter here as well, by which you break the Voronoi pattern on your fracture. And another option over here is the proxy geometry, which gives you a first layer of secondary fracture. So this way, you not only get like uneven shapes, but also uneven sizes of pieces, all with a single button. And then you have constraints specific to that particular section. So you have some basic constraints like strength scale, stiffness scale, and angular stiffness scale, which is something you would majorly be tweaking when it comes to like any sort of metal deformation or like any sort of like fracturing. And this is specific to this particular section. So you get to tweak the constraint strength and stiffness independent to each section as well. And you can also set some color to it. That way you can differentiate each constraints between the section. And this is a good time to maybe look at the display section that's like right above the tire section. So the display is basically when you enable the display to either geometry or proxy or constraints is when your car fracture shop actually starts cooking. It actually starts fracturing, and it takes like 15 to 20 seconds depending on how high dense your geometry is. And then you get to see the geometry, the constraints, and the proxies. You also can separate each section, isolate them, and view them independently, which makes it much easier when you're viewing things on the viewport. You can disable the show section connector constraints. That cleans up the viewport. Again, you don't see the constraints, you just see all the pieces. And then you have a show sections tab, which basically adds a color to each section, again, giving you a visual sense of what you're fracturing your car into. And then moving on, you have a whole constraints section, again, within the shop, which is separated into three tabs again. You have a section connector constraints tab, which, again, you saw those different colorful constraints right before, right? So those are basically the constraints that connect each section to each other. And you can increase the search radius and like look for pieces that are farther away. You can even like adjust the strength and the strength variance. And the breakable chassis connector is basically a toggle which allows you to set your chassis constraints to be breakable. So your chassis constraints come with a strength of -1, which means that it doesn't really break. It like holds on to the car. It's like that one part of the car doesn't really break. But by setting it to be a breakable chassis connectors, it basically switches into having a strength of 1,000 or something, thereby making it like a proper glue constraint. So with like enough impact, it breaks apart, and you also get your chassis to break if you would want it in a specific situation. You also have the switch constraint type, so all your section connector constraints are basically just glue constraints. But with the switch constraint type, you can even switch it to be a glue to soft switch, again with the click of one button. And then you have a global constraint attribute parameters, which again tweaks the constraints globally, like for every sections, for all the section connectors as well. You have a strength scale, stiffness scale, and plastic hardening scale. So this is somewhere I go to, because when I set the constraint iterations on my bullet solver to a higher level, I would essentially need to set my glue strength to a lower value, which allows it to break apart easily. And adjusting it over here seemed to be very beneficial, because I don't have to go and pick each constraint individually, because I already have set up the constraint parameters for each section independently. So I know how it's going to break, but I just want to like reduce it globally. And this is a really good place to approach doing that. And then you have suspension stiffness. This is something that you might see on the car rig as well. This allows you to like tweak the bounciness of your car. So you can either have your car to be bouncy or not so bouncy. So this, you can do it even in the car rig, but the reason for having it here is because you don't have to like go all the way back. You can even control the same from within the car fracture sub. A disable motor toggle for actually not allowing your car to drive. Imagine your car being fractured into a million pieces and it still drives without even being attached to anything. You wouldn't want that. So we have a disable motors, which basically deletes the motor constraints, thereby stopping your car from driving. You also have a retarget anchors. So if, for example, you are fracturing your front suspensions and you have a frontal impact, some pieces of your front suspension is about to break off, and let's say a piece near the wheel is breaking off, your wheel would basically still be stuck without anything in the surroundings. But by setting that wheel in the retarget anchor group, it kind of switches the name of the wheel to the piece nearby, which is going to break away, and you also have your wheel breaking away. So this way you don't have any sort of like weird wheel sticking in like mid-air scenario. The RBD section gives you some inputs, which, like, for example, you can poly reduce your geometry, which makes it less heavier on the bullet sim. This reduces the proxy geometry, to be precise. You have the compute collision padding, which you can adjust here or on the bullet solver. It does basically the same thing, just like more control, more scope for control. And you have a match input density parameter. So one of the new things in Houdini, Houdini 21, you might have seen is like a new interface for the node info panel. So if you rig a car using the car rig, you're going to see something like this on the car rig. So you have a message being displayed which shows the weight of the car, weight of all four wheels together, and weight of the whole car, including the four wheels, in kilograms. And so with this, you can, by enabling match input density on your car fracture, you can either retain the same weight of your car that comes out of the car rig, or you can also set it on your car fracture sub. For example, over here, I've reduced the weight by 100 kilograms. And you're not, again, restricted to all the surface level parameters. You can even dive inside and do more constraints and more fracturing. For instance, over here, I fractured the glass a second time to get more smaller, minute pieces. But in doing so, one thing you need to note is you need to copy the section attribute, which is given to each section when you assign the sections on the top level. So this section attribute needs to be copied to all your newer pieces. That's like one manual step that you might have to do. But when you do that, it listens to the whole ecosystem. And then you can set up your RBD connected faces sub for allowing your glass to not be fractured during render time, but only when it breaks out, the inside faces are revealed, and you can do that within this as well. And like I mentioned, you don't have to connect the doors using the constraint to neighbor sections, but instead you can set it up over here by adding some hinge constraints within the car fracture sub. And because everything is still listening to the proxy constraint, geometry, constraints, and proxy pipeline, everything is still going to be procedural. So essentially, we've taken like a big chunk of what you saw over here and put it into one node, which is crazy because it has a lot of advantages, like it removes the need for tedious setups. It accepts unclean topology to a certain extent. You would have to clean your car, which is always a good habit, But then if you have some planar geometry which is not like connected to the nearby geometry, it's okay. It doesn't freak out. Right? It also works with the existing RBD nodes, so you can still use your constraint properties sub, you can still use your material fracture sub, everything's still within the same workflow, same ecosystem. And it's also fast to set up for non-hero assets. Like for example, this car is not like a highly detailed hero asset. You could consider this as something like a mid-ground asset with like enough detail. So it's much faster when you to iterate on these cars, which is like a little lower polygon count than your actual geometry. You can fracture a static, animated, and simulated car, and it's really efficient when you have multiple cars in your scene. So with that being said, what's this CarBD workflow that we're talking about? So with the introduction of this one particular node, how has the workflow changed in my perspective? You have an input car geometry, you rig it up using your car rig, you drive it. So basically you would set up a drive simulation and drive the car. And then you can plug in a car fracture sub. So once you've simulated your drive and maybe cached your points to disk or something, cached it to disk or something, you can fracture the car, and then you have some scope for creative control. You can maybe add more constraints, edit your constraints, etc., and then you can simulate a crash. So again, that big tedious setup is being confined into this one small workflow, which is again not restricting you. You can still break apart and add more to it. And you're not stopping over here. You can even set up a car follow path. Instead of simulating a car, you can animate it along a path, and you can still follow the same. You can still fracture the car, creative control for your constraints, and then crash it again. One cool thing is you can even swap the places. You can first fracture the car and also animate it along a path, and you're not breaking it. You're still not breaking the workflow. But one thing you need to note is, you remember the realign wheels toggle that I mentioned? That is over here, but in a different name. You have an animate wheels and suspensions toggle, which you would enable if you want your wheels to animate along the path. So right before entering the simulation, you might want to just uncheck it, which essentially just resets your wheel. And again, because it is carrying the velocity forward, you can still get the same wheel animation. So it's sort of one small keyframing that you have to do on this one toggle parameter that acts as the realign wheels. And you also need to like compute velocity, because this is just an animation, doesn't really give you any velocity. So you can compute, just add a trail sub right before you enter the simulation, and everything works just fine. But also, if you remember, the car rig in 20.5 came with the ability for you to connect a console to the car rig and drive the car real time. And you might think, okay, well, maybe can I use the ChopNet, connect my console to the car rig, drive the car real time, and then fracture the car, creative control, crash simulation? Nope, not possible. Not yet, at least not yet. Because when you're connecting a console to the car rig, you are essentially feeding it live data. So your car fracture sub assumes it's getting live data every single time it finishes fracturing. So you're going to face a limitation where it doesn't stop cooking. It's going to keep fracturing again and again and again, nonstop. But there is a way to go around this, and I will be talking about that in some time. So moving on, one other thing you could do is maybe you don't want to do two simulations. You just want to drive and crash it in a single setup. You maybe want to do like an animated to active switch. But yeah, this is also, it will work. You can have your car geometry rigged up, you can fracture it and then drive and simulate it. Yes, it works, but one small hiccup, it might be a little slow. Because this time you're not just like driving one single convex hull, you're driving like a lot of pieces now. And again, if you're like me, you might think, hey, maybe I can do it now. Maybe I can connect the car. Yeah, it works. I'm not driving anything, but no, it doesn't work. Trust me, I've tried. Okay, so let's say you've taken this one simple workflow and you've gotten this amazing shot done. You have these amazing actors in the foreground, you have this car crash going on back in the background. It works. You're satisfied. But then your director comes and says, let's increase the speed of the car by 0.1. And you're like, sure, why not? Sounds good. And then what happens, because everything is procedural, everything trickles down this one workflow and everything starts cooking again and again and again every time you make a change, right? So what is a way I can avoid this? So I was like, maybe can I use the simulation points that I get out of the drive simulation to transform my fractured car that is static? Again, my IQ peaked, I'm not gonna lie. So I asked Nick Petit, the developer, and amazing guy, he was like, here's your answer. The car transform sub, another new node in Houdini 21. So what this sub does on the basic level is, it uses the simulation points You can fracture the car, a static car, without any sort of driving or animation. You can fracture a static car to your heart's content. You can use the simulation points, plug it into this one node, all into this one node, and you can transform a fractured car. And one more thing to note is that the realign wheels option is like automatically enabled by default on this car transform sub. But another thing you need to note is when you're outputting your simulation points, you might want to enable the rest_xform attribute in your output tab because it needs this rest_xform attribute to transform your car, right? So Tom in the audience is like, hey, well, we already have a transform pieces sub that does the same. Why do I need another one? Well, you're right to ask that, Tom, but let's see what the transform pieces sub does on like a basic level. You have different pieces with unique names. You have the same number of points with corresponding names. So when using the transform pieces sub, you have points that are moving, your pieces move the same way because it has the same name. And in this scenario, we have pieces with different names, and we have a specific set of points with different names. So what you might have to do is kind of like compile all these pieces based on those points, make sure it has the same name, and you would have to do that for all the geometry constraints in the proxy, and it's painful and it doesn't work. I've tried again. So what's the alternative? And the alternative is that if you look closely, the car fracture sub gives a source name attribute this time on the proxy geometry. So what is the source name attribute? So basically, in your proxy, your input proxy is going to look like this. This is what you get out of the car rig, and this is what you're going to plug into the fracture sub. You have one convex hull called the body. You have 4 different wheels with unique names. And when you fracture the car, the source name retains this particular naming convention. And this source name is what the transform piece, the points also have. So because the points, again, are similar to the number of pieces you see over here. So because the points now have the same names, and we also have the same number of points, and again, all these million pieces are now like confined in like these specific names, using the source name attribute, you can transform your car at ease without any problem. So if you have 2 different animations, say over here, you have 2 different cars like jumping off a ramp, it's definitely different animation, different directions. And in this case, I'm using the same car. You can fracture the car once, static, and then you can use the car transform sub to transform 2 fractured cars. And with the help of my interns and the power vested in me by Google Slides, if I press the next button, you can see an amazing shot over here. So this was the end result of my project, my internship at SideFX. So all of this R&D kind of led into making this one shot. I'd like to thank Dmitry Vlasenko, who was the artist who helped me with the environments, and Jeff Godin and Nick Culver, who helped me with the pyro simulations. Because I was working the dev cycle, it kind of went back and forth, and towards the last minute, I definitely needed some hands on this, and they were very kindful enough to help me. And I also I take this time to thank everyone at SideFX who helped me with this. I have been bugging them with questions nonstop. I'm not sure how they're putting up with me at this point. But anyways, moving on. So because we've released the production build quite some time back, and we're now also looking at daily builds. If you check at the daily build 479, you're going to see some additions to the car transform sub. You have an animation offset tab, which basically, so when you're getting your simulation points out of your drive simulation, it basically means that your wheels have certain attributes which allow it to turn a certain way, which means that it has some steering to it. And this animation offset allows you to blend between the existing steering animation, and you can set some steering animation by yourself using some keyframes over here. So you can blend between the animation you set over here and the existing animation that comes out of the drive sim. If you want to visualize how your wheels turn, you might have to disable the realign wheels, which allows the geometry to turn along with the parameter, but always, always, always keep it enabled when you're entering the simulation. I can vouch for it from experience. Anyways, you also have an additional start frame parameter, which allows you, which is most of the time going to be the same as your simulation start frame, because this is what this node uses as its rest frame to update the goal twist and goal up axes. So if you have a scenario where you want to override the constraints, the steering constraints while your car is crashing, you might want to enable the start frame, set it to the same frame as your simulation, and you can update your constraints under the constraint tab. So by doing this, what you're essentially doing is you're setting up your steering animation manually on the SOP, and you're also allowing it to be overridden when your car is actually crashing and toppling without any sort of mismatch. So what does the workflow look like now with the addition of this other node? You have an input geometry, you rig up your car, you drive it separately now, and then you fracture it separately as a static geometry. And then you, again, have some scope for creative control. You can edit your constraints, you can add more constraints, etc. And then you use your car transform sub to transform your fractured car. This way, your fracturing and your simulation is now independent of each other. But note that if you're doing some major changes on your car rig, for example, changing the center of mass or like changing the wheel scale, you might want to refracture your car and recache it to disk in those instances. But again, it doesn't mean that you have to do it every time. You now have the ability to kind of say, I want to iterate on a certain thing only a certain number of times. Because for the dual crash simulation, I fractured the car maybe twice or thrice when I was updating the car rig. But then when I was tweaking the drive simulation, I was playing around with the acceleration, the brake, and the steering. And I could iterate on that as much as I wanted without having to refracture my car, because those were updates that didn't really affect my fracturing. And after this, again, more creative control, and then you can crash your car. And you can do the same thing with the car follow path. Except for the car follow path, you won't have any simulation points, but you can use your proxy output to drive your fractured car. And now, drum roll, you can definitely drive your car manually and now cache your points to disk. And then you would have to copy the car rig though, remove all the live links, fracture your car, do whatever creative stuff you want, transform it using the car transform sub, and then you can again crash your car. An indestructible workflow for a destructive car. Moving on, after your crash simulation, you could use the RBD deform pieces that allows you to deform your metal. And then you can use the RBD car deform, which again allows you to squish the tires, bend your suspensions. And for that, you would need your car fracture this time as your reference geometry. And you see there's a blank third input for the car deform. That would basically be your height fields if you're using anything for your terrain. After which you would do some post-processing, maybe like, I don't know, calculating velocities in this case. Maybe you want to like animate the wheels a certain way manually. You can do that all after you deform your car, and then you can output your car geometry. Again, we've taken that big chunk of workflow that we saw in 20.5, and we've kind of concised it into this small, approachable workflow that you're still not restricted to. You can still expand upon. So how can we push the limits? Now we've basically understood what we can do with the introduction of these two nodes in Houdini 21. So how can we push the limits? So if we understand the core concept of crashing a car, so we have this car crash that I'm doing over here. The core concept is that this is, again, whatever I'm about to show you is like the version 1 iteration. It's not like the final output, which again means to say that you can get to this version really quickly without having to do any tedious setups. So moving on. So we have this, and so the basic idea is that we have 4 wheels with unique names, like the proxy geometry, and then we have a body, and then we would also need some sort of a chassis group, right? Because this is what is being input into the car fracture sub. You have like a convex hull for the body, 4 different wheels, and then you need some sort of a chassis group on your car geometry as well. So if you're able to kind of look at your vehicle in this sense, you could even crash a minecart. You can probably crash a wooden cart because the car fracture allows for wood fracturing. You can maybe even crash a tuk-tuk because you can drive 3-wheeled vehicles using the car rig. You can even, because it allows for 2 wheels, you can go for a motorbike. And then if you don't even want to use the car rig and simulate something, you can maybe manually animate a vehicle like the snowmobile over here, and you can crash that as well. If you understand, if you kind of bring it under the same context, like body, chassis, etc. And you can even go for an airplane, which is, again, fascinating because the car rig now has another update in 21, which basically has like a fans and propellers tab. So if you have any sort of fans or propellers in your vehicle, say maybe on the engine or like you saw for the airplane, you can set that up in your in this particular group, and then you can set its orientation, set its pivot location. You can adjust the speed scale, and you can basically simulate the fan spinning as your vehicle is driving, which was amazing to me. And through the course of these 8 months, when I was doing that sneak peek shot, there were some hiccups that I encountered, and because of that, I'm here to give you some tips of what you might want to do when you're working in this workflow. So number one is sometimes I couldn't find the constraints. Like I couldn't find the constraints of those individual pieces because it was so small. It acted like a hinge constraint for each piece. It was so small that I couldn't see it. So by enabling the display points in the viewport, you can actually see the number of pieces you have and every single piece is constrained. And then you might have seen some red dots before in some of the previous slides, but that is basically just me manually coloring the wheels to kind of see how it rotates, because I have a lot of time freaked out by thinking my wheels are not spinning, but it was actually spinning and I just couldn't see. So this helped me see it. And then when you're retiming simulations, which was a tough thing to do, when you're retiming simulations, it's always good to retime on points because Houdini works better with points. And also, you might want a lot of substeps. If you're caching it to disk, you might want to cache out at least 10 substeps. Because if you don't do, your wheels are going to do something like this. Because it doesn't have enough substep data to kind of compute the rotation because it's really moving fast. So always retime on points and try to cache some substeps. And you can cache substeps on points, which will make it easier on the disk because now you have the car transform stop, right? So all you need is the points. And then if you see your vehicle like jiggling around like this, maybe it's because you might not have a really clean geometry. You have some interpenetrating pieces which are kind of unsettling and not allowing the car to rest. So that is something that tells you that you have to clean your car geometry. And then when you're computing velocities, you might want to do it before deleting the inside faces. So if you're using the RBD disconnected faces swap for your glasses and for like deleting the inside faces, computing velocity before that works better than doing it after. So that's it. That brings us to the end. So what we saw in this presentation, and also what's new in Houdini 21, is the car fracture swap and the RBD car transform swap, which has essentially made your workflow in fracturing vehicles, not just cars, a little bit more easier and definitely more creative as well. It's not restricting you from doing anything that you would previously do. We saw a lot of different CarBD workflows, which works, which doesn't work, and which works in what scenario. We saw how we can apply the concepts to different vehicles, and also some tips to remember along the way. And if you're interested in seeing how this works, I'm doing a workshop tomorrow afternoon. So I will be walking through a drift crash setup. I'll be walking through my dual car crash file. I'll be walking through another real-time driving scenario. We can go through all of that step by step in person. Over here, I think, either of these halls. But yeah, with that ends my presentation and also my internship at SideFX. So if you guys want to contact me, I'm here. Thank you.
So cool. So cool. Questions? You've got them burning in your head. Think about it. Release it to the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I know where this is going to go.
Hey, that was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what stuff did you want to say, but were worried about going over time or getting too technical? What sort of stuff would you want to share right now?
If I really had the time, I would basically try and walk you through my whole scene file for the double car crash shot, which has a lot of stuff that I experimented and ended up finding a way that made things easier for me. And because I didn't mention that, thank you for also giving me this chance to mention it. That scene file is going to be available on the content library, cleaned up, fully ready to use soon. And I will let you guys know when that's up as well. So maybe that's one thing I would like to maybe share more details upon. Yeah, English.
Also, if you're watching this from India on the internet, Viswesh is going to be doing the workshop in Hyderabad, yeah? Or no,
Chennai.
In Chennai, later in October. We'll see you there. Question.
All right, great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious, when it comes to RBD workflows, I've been using the Houdini procedural lock to instance my geometry. Is there an equivalent for I know there's a difference between the transform pieces swap and then the car transform swap. Is there a Solaris implementation of that, or can you use Houdini procedurals in there as well?
I I'm not sure if there's like a Solaris version or something that you could maybe use over there. But one thing that I think would help you is maybe if you want to use the transform pieces, or I mean, you might know this answer. It's like I don't think I'm going to be saying anything new, but we could. We do have the SOP create node, which gives us like the whole SOP context inside LOPS. Maybe that is a way for you to bring whatever you want into LOPS. I believe, because I really don't think there's an equivalent of this in the LOP context, though. We do have instancing, which is again you instancing geometry based on points. But then again, we're talking about like moving points, which you could use the instancer for as well.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Going once, going twice. Awesome stuff this way. Really good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, thank you.